Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really taking a plunge into the early life and, well, the incredible rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. You've given us this stack of material specifically, some really interesting excerpts from a major biography on him.
That's right, a deep look into the sources.
And our mission today basically is to sift through this rich account together. We want to pull out the most revealing insights, maybe some surprising details, and those key turning points, not just facts, but the things that really shaped who Napoleon became,
Yeah,
all straight from this material. Okay, let's unpack what we found.
absolutely. And the biography kicks off right at the beginning, focusing pretty intensely on his school days. What's immediately striking, I think, is the picture it paints of his time at the military school in Brienne. You might imagine it being, well, tough, Spartan maybe.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But the source material reveals something quite different. It talks about surprising luxury.
Oh, like what?
Well, the account details these splendid blue uniforms, silver braid, fresh linen 3 times a week, a new uniform twice a year. There were doorkeepers, shoemakers, even like 150 servants just for the students.
Wow.
Yeah. And the biography notes this level of luxury actually rather shocked young Napoleon. He came from a much less, opulent background in Corsica.
That's a fascinating detail. So he's stepping into this world of French privilege, but even then, the material shows he wasn't just like passively taking it in. He was already grappling with some pretty big ideas, right?
Right, exactly. There's this great anecdote about him sharply rejecting the common idea back then that brilliant classical authors, the ones he was studying, were, condemned to hell just for being pagan.
Really, even then.
Yeah, the biography says he found that notion just spectacularly absurd, even as a young man. It shows an early sign of this independent, rational mind already questioning the received wisdom.
And his intellectual anchor at this point, the material says it was Rousseau.
Yes, very much so. Rousseau was a major philosophical lodestone for him then, particularly because Rousseau had actually written quite positively about Corsica,
Oh, okay.
which, directly connects to a core tension the biography really highlights in Napoleon at this time.
Yeah.
His fierce Corsican nationalism.
Right, that deep pride in his homeland. But this is where the contradiction kicks in, isn't it? He's fiercely Corsican, yet his whole position at Brienne is funded by the French state because he'd been accepted into the French nobility.
Exactly, the tension. He's drawing on French resources because of his, French status, which totally clashed with his Corsican identity. The account even includes this really telling moment at the military school in Paris where a senior officer basically puts him in his place, sternly saying, Sir, you are a king's cadet. You must remember this and moderate your love for Corsica, which is, after all, part of France.
Oof, that must have been tough.
Yeah, it starkly illustrates that early conflict of identity he had to navigate.
And navigating that must have been incredibly isolating. The material really paints his school years as, well, difficult socially.
It paints a picture of him feeling like an Ishmael, struggling to make friends, apparently making bitter enemies almost just by existing. Integration wasn't easy for him, it seems.
And we also start to see, even this young, the beginnings of that flexible, maybe even opportunistic approach to rules, the kind of thing that became a hallmark later on.
Oh, definitely. The biography gives a very specific example. After serving only 9 months in his regiment, he somehow managed to get nearly 2 years of leave.
2 years? Well, through medical certificates and basically lobbying the bureaucracy about some family mulberry groves, apparently, all while supposedly too unwell for military duty.
Huh.
The account calls this an extremely complacent attitude on the part of the ancient regime military authorities. Complacent attitude.
Yeah, that's a polite way of putting it. Maybe the system was a bit, lax. This really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How much did the system itself, with its loopholes or flexibility, kind of inadvertently enable his early moves, set the stage?
It certainly suggested as a factor, yeah. And the biography reflects on how this whole mix, Corsican culture, Rousseau's ideas, Enlightenment values, created these confusions and contradictions inside him that weren't easily resolved. So while some might see his later indulgence of family as purely, a Corsican thing, the material notes these internal contradictions stuck around even after he supposedly jettisoned Corsica.
Yeah.
The roots of his complex character were already pretty firmly intertwined.
So from this complex personal grounding, we move into his military development. The material you sent really emphasizes the crucial training he got.
Yes, his education under figures like Dutaya was absolutely key. The biography highlights how he became this artilleryman non parade, not just from books, but from a combination of serious, hands-on field work, actually going out, studying the terrain, paired with just voracious reading. So theory and practice combined.
Exactly. He wasn't just book smart. He was applying that knowledge constantly.
But even that wasn't smooth sailing. Health issues were a problem.
Yeah, the account mentions pretty significant attacks of fever, malaria early on. He put it down to miasmata, which was the understanding at the time, not knowing about mosquitoes. Health was definitely a recurring challenge.
Now, a major turning point highlighted in the biography is what it calls the traumatic denouement of the Corsican saga, around 1792-93.
This is described as the key psychological moment, the birth of the mature Napoleon, as the source puts it. It was this forced final break with his homeland and a clear realization that his ambition could only really be fulfilled elsewhere in France.
And his ambition was definitely growing by then.
Oh, yeah. With his family getting a bit more stable financially, thanks to Archdeacon Lucien's money and his brother Joseph getting a position on the island, Napoleon's strategy was basically to turn his furlough into something more permanent. He aimed to become a significant military force on the island itself by getting appointed adjutant major in a volunteer company.
Which required some fancy footwork with the rules again.
Exactly. There was a National Assembly law saying officers had to return to their regular units, but he narrowly dodged it. Apparently, General Rossi petitioned the Minister of War specifically for his commission in the Corsican volunteers.
So he gets this position, consolidating power on the island. But his long-held admiration for Paoli, the Corsican leader, that was starting to crumble.
Yeah, the biography recounts an interview between them that left both men pretty dissatisfied. What's really fascinating here, the material points out, is how their accusations mirrored each other. Paoli called the Bonapartes restless, ambitious, aggressive, and treacherous, and those were exactly the words Napoleon later used against Paoli after the break.
Wow. So it wasn't just a disagreement, it was a really bitter personal split. The material even mentions an attack from Napoleon's own propaganda piece, Le Super de Beaucaire.
Yes, in that work, he just lays into Paoli, accuses him of deception, crushing liberty, firing on Republic ships, confiscating property. It shows how deep the animosity became and how public he made it.
And this whole messy experience seems to have finally made him realize where the real power, the real opportunities were.
The biography is crystal clear on this. He came to see that the glittering prizes, the real scope for power, influence, recognition, they were only going to be found in France, not Corsica. The break with Paoli was that final step in accepting reality.
Okay, so with Corsica effectively behind him, his focus shifts entirely to France.
Yeah.
And the siege of Toulon is presented as this critical first step in his climb.
Absolutely crucial. The material details how he openly denounced the generals in charge, Carteau and Maret, for incompetence. And this denouncement, importantly, was backed by his political ally, Salicetti.
And that led directly to a promotion.
Led directly to his promotion to major, yes.
And that alliance with Salicetti continued to pay off during the siege itself.
Yes, significantly. Salicetti and another representative, Gasperin, appointed Brigadier Dutheil, remember, his old patron from military school, to oversee the artillery. This basically gave Napoleon, Dutheil's protege, a free hand on artillery matters during the siege. It let him implement his plans and really prove himself on a bigger stage.
Right. And following Toulon, he moves into the Italian campaign. Here, the biography highlights something key and, well, ethically complicated about his strategy, how the army paid its way.
The material really emphasizes his strategy of the army living off the land. And look, this wasn't just a tactical choice, it was pretty much a necessity. The Directory back in Paris was basically bankrupt, and the armies were huge. His army carried only like 3 days' worth of supplies compared to the Austrians who had 9. So this reliance on requisitioning, on extraction, it became a defining feature with, significant consequences.
And speaking of consequences and funding,
Yeah.
This is where the biography directly challenges Napoleon's own story about that campaign, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. While Napoleon later claimed he brought nothing back from Italy but his soldiers' pay, the material you sent just flatly calls this an absurd and transparent lie.
Absurd lie. That's pretty blunt language for a biography.
It is. The account details how he connived with his brother Joseph to extract just vast quantities of treasure. And this wasn't just like lining his own pockets. It was used for major family expenses, building lavish houses, sending siblings to expensive schools, providing huge dowries. Joseph basically acted as the family banker, managing these secret funds.
So it was systematic.
Yeah, the insight here is that even really early on, this systematic exploitation of conquered territory for personal and family gain was central to how he operated. It completely undermines that image he cultivated of the selfless revolutionary soldier.
That really changes the perspective.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, back in France, the political scene sounds like it was just a complete mess, which Napoleon had to navigate somehow.
Oh, completely. The Directory was deeply divided. You had Barras pushing for peace pretty much at any cost, while someone like Rubel wanted to actively export revolutionary ideas through war. And the material points out that neither side really saw eye to eye with Napoleon. He was operating with a surprising degree of independence, trying to manage this complex, often contradictory political landscape back home while running a major campaign abroad.
So we're seeing the military genius emerge, the political maneuvering, but the material also gives us this really fascinating and sometimes, frankly, shocking look into his personal life and family dynamics, which were deeply tangled up with his rise to power.
They absolutely were. The biography notes, for instance, that he was apparently a man of exceptional sexual vigor, which might surprise some people, but also that he kept his own mother, Letizia, at arm's length after he married Josephine. Their relationship apparently grew quite distant and cool after that.
And his relationship with Desiree Clary is also explored. That sheds light on his approach to romance, maybe, and alliances.
Yeah, the material confirms they were engaged, and it notes that the potential dowry made sense to the hard-headed Napoleon, which gives you some insight into his pretty pragmatic view of relationships, even seemingly romantic ones. His letters to her are described as, well, not very romantic, even critical sometimes. But what's particularly revealing is how the Bonaparte clan later used Desiree's marriage to Bernadotte, the future Marshal and King of Sweden, as this deliberate scheme to neutralize or co-opt a dangerous political rival.
How do they do that?
Apparently, Desiree, maybe without fully realizing it, became a channel for information. She passed intelligence about what was going on in Bernadotte's household to Joseph's wife, Julie, who was Desiree's sister.
Wow, family intrigue.
Deep intrigue. And the biography also confirms Desiree really disliked Josephine. Strongly.
And speaking of Josephine, the material highlights two things about her that immediately jump out and seem to define their incredibly complex relationship.
First, yes, she was an older woman. The source actually references Jung's idea of a mother complex in relation to Napoleon choosing an older partner. Second, and this is well known but detail here, she was habitually unfaithful. The biography states Napoleon knew she was continuing her affair with Hippolyte Charles, but apparently feared the public scandal more than the infidelity itself.
So he tolerated it just to protect his reputation. Is that the idea?
Well, the insight from the material goes a bit deeper and maybe darker than just pragmatism. It suggests a really disturbing dynamic, stating he actually enjoyed participating in his own secret humiliation, like a masochistic urge, combined with this quasi-sadistic way he had of toying with her about it.
That's unsettling.
It paints a very complex and frankly unhealthy picture. The material also provides evidence of her own maneuvering. It mentions a letter where Josephine apparently got Barras, the director, to help cover up her connection to a corrupt army provisioning company contract.
Good grief. The family drama didn't stop there, did it?
Yeah.
The siblings sound like a real handful.
Oh, they were. Lucien is described as a spoiled neurotic who deeply resented his older brother's success. He married an illiterate innkeeper's daughter, partly, it seems, just out of spite. And later, he openly defied Napoleon with another marriage. The biography recounts this incredibly heated argument where, according to one version, Napoleon called Lucien's wife a whore, and Lucien just shot back, "At least my whore is pretty."
Aye.
And the material also points to Lucien as being the most active in spreading nasty rumors about Napoleon and his stepdaughter, Hortense de Beauharnais.
And Pauline, his famous favorite sister. She sounds like quite the character, too.
Pauline is depicted as just stunningly beautiful with this magnetic sex appeal. The material refers to her as a byword for nymphomania and lubriciousness.
Strong words.
Very. She was apparently incurably frivolous, spent absolutely colossal sums of money, was often a public embarrassment. The biography mentions her sticking her tongue out at Josephine and had this string of lovers, including, according to the account, a 72-hour sexual marathon with the future Marshal MacDonald.
Wait, a 72-hour? Seriously? That's in the biography.
That specific detail is mentioned in the source material we looked at, yes.
Okay. And his other sisters, Louisa and Caroline.
They're described by the source as power devils, both driven by ambition, intensely jealous of Napoleon, and also habitually unfaithful. Elisa, called the Ugly Sister, ran a literary salon and apparently effectively just expelled her husband from her life.
So despite all this family drama and his own complex relationships, his general attitude towards women sounds pretty negative based on this material.
Yeah, the biography states his overall attitude was basically contemptuous and even boorish. There's this specific anecdote about him trying to arrange a liaison with Laura Paramon, who was the wife of his own general, Junot, while they were guests in his house. It shows a real lack of respect for boundaries, for social norms.
Right. Shifting back to his military circle,
Mm.
the material also identifies some key marshals from his early career and gives insight into why he chose them, right?
It does. The biography names figures like Marat, Lannes, Ney, Davout, Massena, Bernadotte, Berthier, Soult as being associated with him early on. Berthier, his chief of staff, gets particular praise. Energy, lucid mind, great organizer, terse dispatches. But what's really revealing is that the material notes Napoleon totally overlooked Berthier's, well, physical appearance, and his quirks. Apparently he was gauche, stammered, bit his nails. Napoleon focused purely on his administrative talents.
Competence over appearance.
Exactly. And those talents were enhanced in Napoleon's eyes, the source says, by Berthier's lack of ambition for a field command.
Ah, so he valued competence but also loyalty, and, crucially, a lack of threat to his own supreme authority. Makes sense.
Precisely. The biography also mentions some puzzling omissions from his later list of marshals, like Junot maybe, because he had a quick, maybe indiscreet tongue. And Suchet, who was apparently underrated but fell out with Massena and declined the offer to go to Egypt. It suggests his choices weren't always purely merit-based. Personal dynamics, past history, they played a role.
Okay, all of this brings us to that critical period of consolidating power leading up to the 18 Brumaire coup. We touched on the Bernadotte marriage connection earlier.
Yes, as we noted, the Bonaparte clan saw that marriage to Desiree Clary as a very strategic move. Basically, to neutralize a potential rival, using Desiree to gather intel from the Bernadotte household via her sister Julie, Joseph's wife. Clever, if ruthless.
And Napoleon himself had some interesting habits or beliefs leading right up to the coup.
Yeah, the material includes these great little details, like the coup being postponed from a Friday because he was superstitious about the day.
Really? Superstitious.
Apparently so. And on the night before the coup, he actually dined with some of his key Jacobin rivals, like Bernadotte and Jourdan, specifically to lull their suspicions. Calculated move.
And his ultimate goals for the coup. They weren't exactly the same as everyone else involved, like Sias.
No, they diverged significantly. While Sias maybe envisioned a more political transition, Napoleon, according to the biography, intended a much more significant role for the army in actually seizing control. He wasn't just going to be Sias's sword.
The morning of 18 Brumaire itself. The material sounds like it has some specific, almost cinematic details.
It really does. The account describes Napoleon getting up at 5 a.m., finding his lucky star in the pre-dawn sky, whistling out of tune as he got ready. He summons the Council of Ancients for this urgent, super early meeting, and you get this detail of the sound of dragoons moving through the streets at 6 a.m., drawing sleepy citizens to their windows. It definitely wasn't a quiet, behind-the-scenes takeover.
And the aftermath clearly produced distinct winners and losers among the key players involved.
Oh, yeah. Bernadotte was definitely a loser. The material notes Joseph Bonaparte successfully marginalized him on the day itself, apparently, by taking him out for lunch outside Paris while the Directory was being dissolved.
Taken for lunch, that's brilliant.
Devious, right? Meanwhile, Fouché, Talleyrand, Marat, and Napoleon's brother Lucien, they were the major winners. Bernadotte later regretted his inaction, blaming partly his own weakness, partly that family connection through Desiree and Julie that tied his hands. But Napoleon, surprisingly, forgave Bernadotte. The biography notes it was partly for Desiree's sake, and partly because he saw him as family, now through Joseph's marriage. He even gave him commands later.
Moving from the coup that made him first consul to the decision to become emperor. The material you provided links this pretty directly to a specific plot against him, doesn't it?
Yes, the Pichegrucadoodle plot, this royalist conspiracy to assassinate him, was basically used as the justification, the catalyst. The thinking was, by establishing a hereditary dynasty, assassinating Napoleon himself would become pointless. The succession would be guaranteed. And this move served multiple political purposes, according to the biography.
Okay, what were those key purposes? It wasn't just about security.
No, it was politically very shrewd. First, it cowed the royalists by removing their primary objective, killing him to restore the monarchy. Second, it silenced those ultra-Republicans who suspected he might actually bring back the Bourbons himself. And third, maybe most importantly, it reassured the notables and the Thermidorians, all those people who bought up national property confiscated during the Revolution. It signaled their property, their wealth was secure under his rule. By becoming emperor, he basically joined their ranks.
Right, he cemented the gains of the revolution in his own person, essentially locking out the old regime.
Exactly. The biography argues that becoming emperor decisively rebutted the Jacobin canard, the rumor that he would restore the king. It convinced both sides, royalist and republican, that there could be no going back to 1789.
Yet, even with the imperial title, that family, they continued to be a source of significant challenges, personal drama.
Oh, absolutely. Lucien's defiant second marriage remained a huge point of anger for Napoleon, and his mother, Letizia, actually sided with Lucia in that dispute. The material suggests this contributed significantly to the coolness between her and Napoleon, and maybe even led to her rather formal title, Madame Mère, Madame Mother, a title she supposedly earned by siding with Lucien against the emperor.
As the empire grew, so did the scale of his military challenges. The material goes beyond just the early, seemingly effortless triumphs.
Yeah, even campaigns that were victories, like Jena against Prussia, were apparently met with surprising gloom back in Paris, according to the biography. Unlike Austerlitz, the public mood had shifted. People wanted peace, especially with Russia. It shows a growing disconnect between Napoleon's ambitions and what the French people wanted.
And the Battle of Eylau is specifically singled out as a moment where that myth of his invincibility really started to crack.
The material is quite blunt about Eylau. It says there, the myth of his invincibility was plain to see. It's attributed partly to a breakdown in the military machine, but also to Napoleon's own blunders during the battle. It notes he only escaped complete disaster through a lucky gamble, Murad's massive, desperate cavalry charge.
A lucky gamble, not pure genius.
Yeah.
Then there's the Spanish intervention. The material paints that as a major, major mistake.
It calls it a quagmire, straight up, and the biography attributes it to Napoleon's pride, arrogance, and lack of imagination. He just fundamentally failed to understand the depth of Spanish national pride and the resistance he would face. It became this huge drain on French manpower, on money, didn't really serve French interests long-term, drove a wedge between Napoleon and the French elites, the notables, and financially crippled France.
Did he have any support in Spain?
Well, the material notes that his brother Joseph, whom he put on the throne, did get some support from local collaborators. The biography uses the term quislings, or afrancesados. Historians still debate whether these guys were naive idealists hoping for reform under the French or just opportunists.
And the economic strain wasn't just Spain, was it? His big strategy against Britain, the continental system, that had major negative impacts closer to home, too.
Oh, definitely. The system, designed as this economic weapon to strangle Britain, it took on a life of its own. The biography describes it creating this kind of European economic flock. Sure, it protected French production to some extent, but simultaneously ruined traders in places like Germany and really inflamed national feelings when French officials started seizing and publicly burning contraband goods. Plus, failures in the licensing system meant Britain still got essential supplies, like wheat, and it ended up provoking a war with the U.S., but too late to really help Napoleon.
And internally, inside France itself, the economic fallout was severe.
The material details that the 1810 decrees, which really tightened the system, triggered a grave economic crisis in France. Paris was somewhat buffered, they had soup kitchens and stuff, but the provinces suffered badly. Shortages, high prices leading to increased death rates, widespread begging, Luddism smashing machines, brigandage, even violent riots, especially in Normandy. Napoleon actually had to send in the Grand Army, his elite troops, internally and order executions, including women, to crush the unrest.
Using the Grand Army at home.
Yeah.
That's a stark image of the domestic cost.
It's presented as a really key moment, the parting of the ways, the biography calls it, between Napoleon and the notables, the elites. They became increasingly wary of his gigantic gambles. And the material also notes that the peasants, the backbone of his army through conscription, were just getting tired. Tired of endless wars that seemed less about defending France or the revolution and more about his personal ambition.
This backdrop of shifting opinion, economic strain, it leads right into the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812. The material explains its origins from the Tsar's point of view.
Yes, the biography highlights Tsar Alexander's list of grievances, which had been building up. Napoleon had refused him a free hand in Turkey. He kept delaying the promised division of the Ottoman Empire. Plus, Napoleon significantly enlarged the Duchy of Warsaw right on Russia's border. He annexed German territories like Oldenburg, whose heir was the Tsar's own brother-in-law, and then he installed Bernadotte, a former French marshal, as Crown Prince of Sweden right next door. These were all major provocations from Alexander's perspective.
Before the invasion even starts, the material mentions some interesting psychological takes on Napoleon's state of mind around then.
Yeah, it touches on references to maybe an Oriental complex, this draw towards the East, and the idea of him seeing himself as almost an existentialist figure defying fate. The biography even includes a reference to a supposed warning from his Red Man, this sort of personal omen or spirit figure he supposedly believed in advising him not to invade Russia, a warning he famously ignored.
Wow. And logistically, the campaign itself,
Yeah.
the details provided make it sound like an absolute nightmare from day one.
A total breakdown, yeah. The army immediately outran its supply lines. The wagons they had broke down on the terrible Russian roads. Crucial stores had to be just dumped by the wayside. And starvation became a threat incredibly quickly because the initial already insufficient rations were eaten up way too fast.
And the material actually points a finger of blame for this logistical chaos.
Mhm.
It wasn't just bad luck or bad roads.
It specifically blames a lack of the firm smack of discipline coming from the emperor himself. Apparently, he allowed his officers far too many luxuries, multiple servants, extra horses, which contributed to this enormous tail of camp followers. These non-combatants wasted precious resources and literally clogged the roads, preventing the essential supply convoys from getting through to the troops at the front.
The biography also mentions specific military moments during the advance where opportunities were missed, mistakes were made.
Yes, it notes some early successes, like Murat and Eugene beating the Russians at Ostrovno. But then, strategic errors creep in. Barclay, the Russian commander, decides to stand and fight near Vitebsk, but Napoleon delays his attack, allowing the Russians to slip away. The French cross the Dnieper River successfully. Things look promising for a moment, but then Murat wastes a crucial day at Krasno, letting the Russians escape again. And Napoleon's own 24-hour pause at Smolensk allows the two main Russian armies under Barclay and Bertrand to link up and retreat together. The material identifies these as critical blunders.
And the retreat from Moscow. That brought just devastating news, even before they got close to friendly territory.
Yeah, arriving back at Smolensk during that horrific retreat, they got hit with a flood of terrible intelligence. Confirmation of desperately low food stocks there, news of Russian maneuvers cutting off their potential escape routes. And critically, news finally arrived from Paris about the Malay coup attempt, this failed bid to overthrow him back home. That severely hit morale. The account describes a complete collapse of French morale at that point, including an entire division just surrendering lamely.
Sounds like a cascade of failure and bad news. The material even quotes Napoleon himself, reflecting on one specific crucial decision during that retreat.
Yes, apparently on St. Helena, according to the biography, Napoleon conceded that pressing on from Smolensk instead of stopping there to winter was probably the greatest blunder of his life. Although, characteristically, he tried to rationalize it. Claiming time was against him, he feared Russia would get stronger, maybe allies would switch sides if he delayed, but he admitted it was a mistake.
Which brings us to the tumultuous final years, starting with the political crisis back in France in 1814 after the defeat at Leipzig.
Yeah, the material describes the legislative body actually censuring Napoleon, but he refused to listen. He just dissolved the body and issued this incredibly defiant declaration. You are not the representatives of the nation. The true representative of the nation is myself. France has more need of me than I have need of France.
Wow, that's bold.
Incredibly arrogant, right. The biography even notes he hinted he might lead a Jacobin-style revolution against the notables, the elites, if they got in the way of the war effort. Shows his desperation and maybe how isolated he'd become from the classes that had supported him.
But despite this defiance and the terrible military situation, Allied disunity actually offered a potential lifeline, didn't it?
Yes, for a moment. Austria and Britain especially were getting wary of growing Russian power on the continent. So initially they were willing to offer France her natural frontiers, basically, returning to pre-revolutionary borders, but still larger than the 1792 boundaries. It was a possible deal. And you had the ambitious Bernadotte, now crowned Prince of Sweden and fighting against Napoleon, even harboring hopes he might be called back to France as the next emperor.
The 1814 campaign itself, the material describes it with striking contrast, doesn't it? Genius and betrayal side by side.
Exactly. The biography notes Napoleon's undeniable military brilliance during that campaign, often fighting outnumbered and still winning battles. Wellington himself is quoted later, saying that studying the 1814 campaign gave him a greater appreciation of Napoleon's genius than anything else.
High praise from his ultimate victor.
Indeed. But at the same time, the campaign was marked by astonishing levels of treachery, with Talleyrand specifically named as a key betrayer. The material is pretty critical of historians who try to apologize for Talleyrand, suggesting their view of his motives is maybe a bit naive.
Amidst all this political backstabbing and military struggle, there's a poignant detail about Marie Louise's loyalty presented in the account. His wife.
Yes, her correspondence from 1814 is highlighted. It shows a really remarkable level of loyalty and genuine love for Napoleon, despite everything falling apart. Letters mention her saying she's growing very brave after hearing of his military successes, his affectionate nickname for her, child, and this really moving anniversary letter where she recalls the birth of their son as a moving proof of your love.
That's quite touching. How did he respond?
Well, the sad insight here, according to the source, is that Napoleon, apparently sunk in self-pity after his first abdication, seemed almost unable to respond to her warmth and loyalty.
After that first abdication and his exile to Elba, he wasn't entirely alone, though. Some loyal family members joined him.
Yes, the loyal women in his life mainly. Pauline, his sister, famously said, "We must not leave the emperor alone," and his mother, Letizia, also came. And there's that surprising, almost humanizing detail from the biography. Apparently, they would play cards in the evenings, and the emperor cheated shamelessly.
He cheated at cards. Seriously.
That's what the material says. Adds a weird touch, doesn't it? Marie Walewska, his Polish mistress, also visited with their son, but Napoleon's attitude towards her during that visit is described as curious, kind of blowing hot and cold. Apparently, he didn't sleep with her during the visit and then regretted it later. The material does note, though, that Marie continuously urged him to return from Elba.
His final escape from Elba, the 100 days, and then the flight after Waterloo. That sounds like a period of intense uncertainty and desperation.
The material describes it as an agony of uncertainty, yeah. And his ultimate fate, his capture, was sealed by betrayal once again. Fouché, the police minister, is named as the one who tipped off Wellington about Napoleon's plan to sail to the United States. That led directly to the British naval blockade at Rochefort that trapped him.
There's a famous, almost literary description quoted in the biography, isn't there, about Fouché and Talleyrand meeting the restored King Louis VIII.
Yes, quoting the writer Chateaubriand, the material describes the scene with those incredibly harsh words, vice leaning on the arms of crime. It perfectly captures the perceived corruption and moral bankruptcy of the figures who facilitated the Bourbon Restoration.
His final surrender, walking onto the British ship Bellerophon, is presented as voluntary, which made his subsequent exile feel like a betrayal to him.
Exactly. Because he surrendered voluntarily, the material calls his exile to St. Helena, where the British insisted on treating him merely as a retired general, not as a former head of state, a perfidious action. Napoleon protested vigorously, arguing it would destroy Britain's international reputation. He challenged the whole legal basis for his imprisonment under international law and famously insisted on being addressed as emperor, protesting bitterly against the British, calling him just General Bonaparte.
And life on St. Helena itself, particularly under the British governor, Hudson Lowe, sounds like it was deliberately made harsh.
Oh, yeah. The biography describes Lowe's instructions for managing Napoleon as absolutely draconian, reflecting, in the words of the source, a spirit of pure, vindictive spite. There were extremely strict controls on his household, his spending, his letters, who he could talk to, even where he could walk. The material doesn't mince words. It basically calls it state-sanctioned kidnapping, and quotes an English biographer saying the whole affair is something that makes an Englishman blush for his country.
And even within his tiny exiled court at Longwood, there was still constant drama and intrigue, even on that remote island.
Apparently so. It's described as a restless house, just full of plots and jealousies among his companions. Montholon is identified as a plotter, Gourgaud as mercurial, prone to outbursts, and the material notes may be controversially a possible homosexual element in his devotion. Apparently, he referred to Napoleon as she in his private journal.
Really, she?
That's what the source claims was in the journals, yes. And Las Cases, who was Napoleon's favorite companion for a while, the one taking down his memoirs, was eventually arrested for trying to smuggle correspondence out and was deported. So, yeah, constant tension.
Finally, the material touches on his declining health and the actual circumstances around his death.
It mentions his health clearly deteriorating over the years on the island, his complexion becoming sallow, coughing blood. attributed perhaps to various specific illnesses, maybe liver problems, maybe stomach cancer, but also potentially just to sheer overwork and stress, even in exile. The final illness itself involved conflict between his French doctors and his staff over the right treatment, specifically the use of calomel, a mercury-based compound. And to Marquis, one of the doctors, dissented strongly, but was overruled by the others and Napoleon's companions.
And that leads to his last words.
Yes, there's that incredibly poignant, tragic detail of Napoleon's last words to his loyal valet, Marchand, after being given the calomel against his doctor's advice. "You're deceiving me, too." A final expression of mistrust. The biography also notes this final little drama, a debate between General Bertrand, his loyal companion, and the priest present over whether to administer the last rites to the famously free-thinking emperor. A cleric ultimately did administer extreme unction despite Bertrand's objections.
Wow. So this deep dive into the material, it really presents just an incredibly complex picture, doesn't it? We've traced this path from a boy shocked by luxury at school, wrestling with a fractured identity and these big ideas, through his rise as this military genius, marked by both unbelievable brilliance and, well, significant blunders. A ruler whose grand ambitions and deeply flawed personal life were just constantly intertwined, surrounded by this ambitious, often difficult family and treacherous allies, ending his days in miserable, isolated exile, questioning even those closest to him on his very deathbed.
Yeah, and the biography offers several ways to look at his whole story. It describes him as an artist monk, a failed artist who saw his own life as a kind of novel he was writing, observing his other self doing these remarkable things, believing he lived somehow on equal footing with destiny itself. He could be utterly ruthless, but then also, intermittently, quite sentimental. An old-style autocrat, the material argues, rather than a modern totalitarian figure.
And this whole incredible journey, particularly that island odyssey from Corsica to Elba to St. Helena, the biography even frames that through these psychological, mythological lenses, referencing ideas like Jungian quaternity or seeing him as a kind of Prometheus figure chained to a rock.
It's a narrative that's just incredibly rich in potential meaning and interpretation, as the biography clearly demonstrates.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, based on everything we've explored in this deep dive? Was Napoleon ultimately defined more by his extraordinary willpower, his ability to shape events through sheer force of personality and ambition?
Yeah.
Or were there larger external forces at play? The times he lived in, the people around him, maybe even his own internal psychological makeup. Did those things ultimately determine his path, almost despite his incredible efforts?
That's the great question, isn't it? One that continues to fuel debate. Absolutely.
Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.